They learned to measure time by the hiss of the furnaces and the cadence of sirens, the steady, metallic heartbeat of a factory at war. At the North American plant in Inglewood, nights kept no promises. Sparks flew like living things, landing on denim sleeves and on the inked palms of men whose hands read tolerances the way a reader reads a page. Outside, the city practiced the rituals of blackout and alert. Inside, the great skin of the Mustang was being coaxed into being, rivet by rivet, alloy by alloy, under a threat that felt at once distant and immediate. If you want to stay with this story to the end and help us remember the men and women who built machines as much as they were used by them, subscribe and ring the bell. There are voices in this history that deserve to be heard. The test cell hummed like a living throat. Steam fogged the high windows. The glow from the furnaces made men's faces look like gods in faded photographs. Frederick Brackett stood at the lip of the observation gallery with his palms tucked into his coat pockets, a thin shawl of soot at his collar. By trade, he was a metallurgist. By temperament, a man who listened to metals the way other men listened to sermons. Tonight, he listened for cracking. A frame of the Mustang's cowling lay bolted into the rig, pipes running from gauges into its core, valves singing like small, weary bells. Brackett had been awake 48 hours. His mouth tasted of coffee and tobacco smoke. When the rig first started, the roar swelled like a storm, settling into a frequency that made the bone behind the ear vibrate. The technicians exchanged small, precise words, the kind that are a language of their own. Sheath reading steady, feeds good, we're at temp. The numbers on the logbook climbed, an arithmetic litany. Pressure, revolutions, oil temperature. They were teaching the metal to live in heat and motion, the way a teacher teaches a child. From the assembly bay below came the slap of hammers, the low, satisfied grunts of riveters. Women in aprons and goggles swung heavy tools with a rhythm the war had taught them, efficiency as survival. Samuel Ortiz, a young mechanic with 2 months of experience and a photograph of his brother folded into his wallet, worked the edge of a wing panel, smoothing the joint where skin met spar. His knuckles were raw but steady. He listened for the small change in pitch when 2 pieces joined properly, and he could tell by ear when a rivet set true. It was easy to narrate the machine as the protagonist of the story. Sleek lines, laminar wing, twin radiators tucked like secret breaths under the fuselage. And the airplane deserved admiration. But Brackett watched craftsmen more closely than he watched metal. He thought in welded sentences about what it meant to teach a metal to keep its shape under madness. There was beauty in it, and there was horror, because every improvement in endurance and range translated directly into distance, and distance made possible missions that could end in fire over cities and islands in the sudden, terrible contraction of lives. The strategic problem had become simple to state and impossible to solve. Allied bombers needed protection. Early in the war, escort fighters ran out of fuel before reaching the targets deep in Europe. Range was, for a time, the deciding factor between a bomber formation intact and a formation shredded. Engineers sketched a solution on cafeteria napkins and on blackboards, an airframe that was efficient, fast, and light, an engine that could breathe long and hard without breaking itself. North American's NA-73X, the first Mustang prototype, had arrived as a clean sheet with a belly full of promise. But promise is not a production schedule. The conversion from prototype to warhorse required thousands of hands and an industrial patience that wartime calendars would not grant. In the test cell, a rhythm of failure and retry stitched the nights together. A bearing would overheat, a heat-soaked crankcase would sing and then fracture. A vibration would find a harmonic the designers had not anticipated. Each discovery required a mental map of cause and consequence, and often an alloy with a hidden tolerance. Brackett leaned into that arithmetic. He pulled chemical charts like old friends from his coat and ran his thumb across entries. Chromium here for strength, nickel for ductility, small additions of vanadium for grain control. The aim was microscopic. Grain size, precipitates, the way a crystalline lattice could bow without shattering. He called it teaching the metal, a phrase he would use so often that the men around him began to repeat the idea in half-joking reverence. "Make the grain walk together," he said once to Ortiz, who stared at him as if Brackett had given a lesson in prayer. "If the grains move as one, the metal will not break like 1,000 small bones." Outside the plant doors, alarms sometimes filled the night with a brittle urgency. The West Coast had been placed on edge after December 7th. There were breakwaters and air raid drills, painted blackout lines over windows, and an occasional Japanese balloon or submarine shelling that reminded everyone the frontier of war could be closer than it looked on paper. There were no sustained raids on Inglewood, no columns of smoke rising over the plant like flags. Yet the sense of being under bombardment, alarms, the sound of distant anti-aircraft guns, the sudden hush of a city gone dark, folded itself into the workers' lives. It sharpened hands, it compressed laughter. It drew tighter the bonds between men and women who saw themselves as caretakers of an airplane that could change the map of losses and survivals. Within those walls, management and military liaisons came and went on a schedule of urgency. Orders arrived stamped with the weight of the field. Orders arrived stamped with the weight of the field. Increase production by 20% within 6 weeks. Brackett learned the language of deadlines as if it were another alloy. He negotiated with foundries and with the Packard engine shops across the country, those Detroit plants where the Merlin, a British workhorse reimagined on American lines, was being assembled under license and given new life. The Merlin's adoption into the Mustang was a turning point that cannot be overstated. Married to the efficient Mustang airframe, it gave the fighter the speed and high-altitude performance that made long-range escort practical. The scene in the engine room could be described without spectacle. Gaskets measured, fuel lines pressure-tested, the careful balancing of propellers whose oscillations could tear a wing away. But spectacle crept in, not from exaggeration, but from the raw human stakes. Pilots wrote letters in the quiet hours, short, clipped notes from training bases, sighs of fatigue, the occasional flourish of hope. At the plant, they pinned those letters to bulletin boards. A note might read, "Bring her home, boys," or, in a small hand, "Come back." The letters acted like small moral compasses for men who could not imagine the foreign night their planes might someday cross.
Lieutenant Frank Reynolds arrived during one of those weeks, an assistant flight engineer on leave for a day, with oil already embedded under his fingernails from the last time he had been at a base. He walked the line slowly, as if the airplane itself required a measure. "She's a beauty," he said, and his voice carried the weary intimacy of someone who had slept in foxholes and under tarps. "You know what she means when she climbs? She means home." The factory created its own ceremonies. A successful endurance run in the test cell was an event, not merely a technical milestone. Men gathered like parishioners, leaning over clipboards with the fanatical attention of the faithful. A test that held without the catastrophic chatter of shards on metal was a small salvation. People shook hands. A foreman swore softly and then smiled. Brackett took these as private mercies. He recorded figures in his logbook in a hand that grew steadier with each success. Failures were more public and more private at once. There was the night a prototype supercharger failed, shivering with a sound that made people flinch. The casing was compromised, and for a moment the metallic howl seemed to name doom. No one was physically mangled in that failure, but the emotional toll was real. The smell of burnt insulation, the way men's conversation grew narrow for hours afterward. Protocols followed: debrief, root cause analysis, orders for redesign. But what lingered was the knowledge that each saved failure could have been a catastrophic loss in combat. That understanding made the men in the factory deliberate, stubborn, almost reverent.
As the Mustang matured, so did the social composition of the plant. Women made up entire sections of the assembly line, rivet guns on shoulders, precision in their eyes. Men returned from training grounds to join them for short stints of home leave, bringing with them stories of missions and the quiet fear that their work had a direct line to life and death overseas. Brackett paid attention to the small economies of trust that formed. A machinist lending a hand to a riveter, a line supervisor petitioning for a rest rotation to ease fatigue. He wrote memos about tempering schedules and about human schedules, because metal could not be expected to perform if the hands that made it were broken in spirit. By 1943 and into 1944, the Mustang had been refined with a laminar flow wing and the Merlin's deeper breath. The airplane's range, once a hope scribbled on drafts, became operational reality. Engineers took a private satisfaction in the numbers. Drag reduced, cruise efficiency increased, fuel economy at altitude that allowed escorts to reach Bonn, Berlin, and back. Pilots reported that the Mustang flew like a dream, and that dream translated into fewer bomber losses on certain missions. The arithmetic of survival altered. Where once bomber formations had gone unescorted and suffered terribly, Mustang squadrons met them and gave them a measure of protection that shifted the strategic calculus. That calculus, however, came with moral blur. Brackett thought of his own work in a dialectic of pride and unease. He remembered, in a small private ritual, the faces pinned to the boards, letters from men who had kissed their wives and climbed into cockpits, and he thought of the cities to which those aircraft would consign their payloads. Engineers, he observed, seldom got to see the other side of their machines. They saw numbers, endurance tests, the way a crankshaft took load. The men who flew saw the human consequences. The men who decided on targets sat in offices with maps and arguments about necessity.
Brackett, who taught metal to keep together under strain, found himself thinking about cause and consequence as if the metal could hear his thoughts. The plant's successes were both industrial triumph and moral mirror. The day the Mustang made its decisive contribution as a long-range escort, it was met with celebration and a hush. Letters came back from the continent with pilots describing missions where bomber formations returned more intact than before. Men in the plant read those dispatches in the same breath as they read casualty lists. "We made them with our hands," Ortiz said to a small circle during a coffee break. And in his voice was the mixture of pride and pinched grief that the war inflicted on anyone who counted themselves a maker. "We made their wings." Across the Atlantic and Pacific, other machines changed maps in more literal ways.
The Mustang's endurance made it possible for formations to reach targets deeper into enemy territory. Its speed and agility increased the survival odds for individual flights. There were decisive missions where the presence of long-range escort reduced bomber casualties and, by some accounts, accelerated the air campaign's effectiveness. But it was inevitable that with power came consequence. The same lines on the engineer's page that promised greater mission success also meant that cities burned longer, that the calculus of total war grew easier and thereby more deadly. Brackett's own moral reckoning was not dramatic. It took place in small intervals. A letter he did not send, folded into the inner pocket of his coat. A night where he dreamt of metal that refused to meet stress and instead bowed out like an old man. A quiet argument with a military liaison who insisted on pushing a schedule despite clear concerns about a component. "We will deliver," the liaison said, voice flat. "We must." Brackett's answer was practical and inward. "Do not let hurry become a habit that erodes judgment." It was as much a plea for craft as for conscience. Outside of testing and production, the city's alarms sometimes fell into a rhythm that made men tired in a way coffee could not fix. Anti-aircraft flak became part of the background. The occasional false alarm, a reminder that nothing in wartime exerted the right to predict safety. In the evenings, some workers would walk home under a blackout sky, the streetlights down, their shadows long and uncertain. Others would sleep on cots near the plant, exhausted and grateful. The factory's doors opened again at dawn, and the work resumed. There were milestones that drew the plant up in pride. The first time a production Mustang went through an endurance flight without mechanical failure, a cheer rose from the observation gallery as if it were a benediction. That flight did not in itself alter the course of the war. It stitched another thread into the tapestry of industrial mobilization. Yet for the men and women who had labored through nights of sparking metal and near misses, the endurance run felt like absolution. They had taught the aircraft to live under strain, and the machine had obeyed. In the test shed after one such successful run, the rig slowed to a thoughtful purr. The men unclipped their headsets and let the silence come like a wave. Brackett stepped down from the platform, shoulders loose for the first time in days. Ortiz, wiping his hands on an oil-streaked rag, looked at the Mustang's skin and said, "She'll get them home." A pilot's photograph on the board fluttered slightly in a draft, as if in applause. Yet even in that small celebration, Brackett's mind moved to the long view. He thought of repair depots in England where Mustangs would arrive,
of airfields in liberated France, of the pilots who would loop and dive and return.
Ill thought, too, of the cities that would be scorched in the final phases of the war, outcomes that technological gains enabled far beyond the factory gates. The wonder was never just in production. It was in the understanding that every metric of success carried a shadow. That was a lesson the men taught themselves quietly. That craft required not only skill, but moral attention. As the months passed and production numbers rose, the Mustang grew from prototype to symbol. Photographs of sleek fighters lined the plant's corridors. Men signed their names under painted slogans and moved on to other tasks. In some corners of the plant, elderly riveters who had once worked in peacetime factories found themselves nostalgic for a quiet that would not return. The war machinery required a scale and velocity that left little room for lingering. On a late spring night, as the plant settled from another long day, a test cell went into its final cycle of the shift. The rig climbed to its prescribed speed, holding steady. Gauges remained within tolerances. Brackett watched the needles with the calm of a man who had seen the machinery threaten and then obey. When the test ended and the silence returned, he felt a small, private triumph. Not because the airplane existed, that was a collective miracle he shared with hundreds, but because the metal had learned its lesson: endurance. He walked out into a night that smelled faintly of oil and distant sea salt. The city beyond the factory was quiet, though not innocent. Somewhere across the ocean, planes would be in the air, engines singing the songs the factory taught them to sing. The men and women who had made that song possible would continue to labor, to worry, and to hope. Behind him, pinned to the bulletin board, a letter folded in a hand he did not know, read simply, "Bring her home." Brackett left it there. He did not answer. He did not need to. His work would be the answer, and it would be both blessing and burden. The night deepened. In the test cell, gauges cooled, valves ticked, and the glow of residual heat faded to a soft ember. Brackett stood a moment longer, listening to the factory's breathing, a low, mechanical respiration that had learned in the crucible of need to be a keeper of lives and a maker of consequences. He thought of a future where the Mustang's lines would sit in museums and in memory, where the hands that had hammered and measured might be remembered not only for what they built, but for what they shouldered. He turned and walked back to the shop floor, where production would resume tomorrow, where the sound of hammers and the scent of cutting fluid would once again be the measure of a day. The metal had been taught. Now the world would learn what that teaching meant. Dawn came like a pale promise through the factory's great windows, thin as a veil over the rows of machines. By the time Brackett reached the shop floor, the air had already filled with the steady percussion of rivet guns and the low throb of lathes. Men and women moved with the practiced choreography of long weeks. A hand passed this way, a wrench offered there, a nod that meant keep going and watch the bolt. The glow from braziers lit faces in the way a theater light can make an audience into a single organism. Fatigue showed in the set of jaws and the stoop of shoulders, but so did resolve. Ortiz found him at the staging table, a smear of grease darkening the cuff of his sleeve. "We got an inspector from the command today," he said without looking up. "Flight's over in the afternoon. They wanted to see a sortie. They want assurances." He spat a little on the floor and turned the rag in his hand. "They said it's urgent." Brackett nodded. Assurances were always urgent. "Then we'll make sure they get 'em," he said. It was not false courage. It was an answer shaped by habit. He moved down the line, checking torque readings, listening to the sound the fittings made when struck, feeling for the subtle looseness a man learns to read by touch. A woman 2 benches down, May, he realized, had pinned a folded piece of paper to the board above her station. He had noticed it at night, caught between feeling and duty. Now, in electric light, the words on the paper were legible. "Bring her home." Beneath the inscription, in a smaller script, a name, E. Leland. May did not look up when he stopped. Her hands kept pace with the rivet gun, a metronome that never faltered. Her face, younger than most among the riveters, bore the kind of tiredness that came from nights of sewing and waiting, and wakened to check the clock. Brackett felt the familiar tug, a private obligation toward those whose losses were given over to him in the form of medal and measure. "How's your run?" he asked lightly, because the simple voice could be less dangerous than his attention. She answered with a tilt of the chin, the corners of her mouth softening a fraction. "Fine. Good seats on the new batches. Inspector wants a demonstration." There was a hitch in the last phrase, as if the word inspector carried the weight of both hope and threat. Before he could speak further, a man in a dark suit, one of the plant's production managers, Thompson, threaded through the benches. His tie was streaked with oil. He carried a folder thick with requisitions and typed pages. "Brackett," he said, "command's ahead of schedule. They want to meet at the airfield at noon. They want a flight. Make sure the batch going out is clean. No excuses. And Brackett," he paused, the folder tapping his thigh, "I know your opinion about the new supplier, but we can't be picky. Quotas, numbers, you know how it is." Brackett did know. He thought of the ledger at night, the columns that rose and fell like tides. He had argued privately about alloys and temper, about how the aluminum from the southern mill felt different, how the grain held grudgingly under a punch. He thought, too, of the men and women on the line who trusted his judgment because he had earned it in the slow and costly school of failures. "I'll run a full check," he said. It was the safest answer. It was also the truest. At the airfield, the Mustang squadrons sat in neat rows, their polished skins reflecting sky and hangar alike. Pilots moved between them like priests about altars. Their exchanges were quick, the humor taut as spring wire. Brackett rode in the lead truck with the inspectors, straps chewing leather into his palm. He had been there often enough to know what to expect from the pre-flight. The checklist, read by voices that had to be practiced until syllables could be trusted. The dozen-minute flight the inspectors demanded felt like a small thing, but small things had clout. The pilot, a Captain Green by the name of his patch, taxied out with the mechanical ease of a man familiar with both fear and speed. Brackett watched the Mustang lift, watched its shadow crawl over the field and then fall away. He listened to the engine's note as if it were music made of wire. For a time, he let himself be swallowed up by the ritual of technical assurance, hands folded like a prayer as the machine performed. The call came back sharp and clipped. "Engine cut at altitude, forced glide to the ridge, pilot down, parachuted. Aircraft impacted,
Investigation underway. Voices around Brackett flattened in the way a struck bell goes mute. For a moment, the world hemmed in on the facts. One pilot down, one aircraft likely lost. Then the airfield's orderly nightmare of discipline reasserted itself. Men moved to tasks, forms were filled out, reasons sought. On the return to the plant, the truck smelled of metal varnish and the cold breath of machinery. Brackett sat with the new report pressed to his knee. The captain's report had been brief. Sudden loss of oil pressure, followed by seizure. It was the kind of failure that could rise from a dozen small betrayals. A fitting not tightened to spec, a feed line that had been substituted, a microscopic fissure carried across with a shipment of parts. He thought of the altered alloy, of the ledger, of the quiet worry he had held like a stone. That afternoon, the men's talk quieted toward the evidence like bees gathering to a flower. Rumors were the inevitable background music in a place where lives were measured in inches and hours. Some spoke of pilot error, others of enemy action. May moved through the line with her usual steadiness, but her hands were not quite in time. Ortiz, who had the patience of a man raised on machines that needed coaxing, took Brackett aside. "They'll want numbers to show," Ortiz said. "They'll want a demonstration. But the men'll talk if we don't say anything. The men'll think we're covering it up if we keep quiet."
His eyes, forever bright and restless, fixed on Brackett as if to pin him as the thing that would not move. We can't let them fly things that fall apart, not if it can be fixed. Brackett had never liked the language of secrecy. His life, such as it was, had been built on the opposite, the directness of measurement, the honesty of a dial. But he also knew the machinery of supply, the pressure on managers to ship, and the thin arithmetic by which a pause could mean buses of men abroad left waiting. He found himself bargaining internally with the shape of consequence. A delay would cost lives in one measure and save them in another. It was the arithmetic of guilt. That night, the workshop emptied more slowly than usual. A moon thick as an unstruck rivet hung over the plant, indifferent and luminous. Brackett stayed and asked for volunteers, and to his surprise, a handful answered. Ortiz, Mai, a machinist named Farrow, 2 apprentices who had been in the place long enough to have calluses that read like passports. They wanted to see if they could replicate the failure in controlled conditions. "If there's a problem," Mai said, "I'd rather find it here than send them up to find it there." They worked with the careful improvisation of people who have learned to make do. They removed the oil feed from a sample engine and wrapped it in worn cloth to simulate the way a line might chafe under vibration. They climbed the tolerance ladder inch by inch, substituting the suspect aluminum for stock, listening to the way the casing sang when hit, and feeling for the ghost of a vibration that might tell of weakness. At 3 in the morning, the machine spoke its language. A harmonic shiver, almost imperceptible, ran along the engine's length. A bracket, one of the lesser parts in the vast family of fittings, trembled, and then, with a sound like an animal's little complaint, cracked. Oil found a new path, and the feed's pressure would have collapsed under flight stresses. The test mocked the dryness of their normal hours, revealing a truth that had been sleeping under numbers. "It starts in the bracket," Farrow said, voice small and certain. "Then the line chafes through. At altitude, it has no mercy."
They traced the bracket back through the plant's records and found a short note in a requisition. Substitute bracket, aluminum, A25, Southern Supply, due to shortage. There were initials at the bottom, a manager's signature. Brackett held the paper as if it were a burning coal. He thought of Captain Green spiraling to a ridge and the parachute blossom, the sudden and terrible bright of a man's decision to leave his machine. He thought of the letters pinned to boards, the "Bring her home," folded like a tiny talisman against an indifferent sky. The next morning, the plant pulsed with a new urgency. The inspectors were to return at 10. The telephone lines hummed with the anxious certainty of men who needed to know whether the plant would be shut down.
Thompson cut short the line of conversation as he moved through the floor, a man rehearsed in the art of turning attention to his advantage. "We'll cooperate with the investigation," he announced in the office, "and until it's concluded, we'll continue production. The country needs these airplanes." Brackett listened to the phrase "country needs" and tasted in it the acrid residue of a truth that could be used to obscure. He went into the manager's office with the Brackett's record in his hand. Thompson's palms were steady on the desk. "If we stop the line," the manager said, "we'll lose our place in the contract. The plant in Dayton will take the order. We can't let that happen." "Then we change the bracket," Brackett said. "We correct the spec, recall the batch that's outstanding, and test each aircraft. It will cost what it costs." "It's not that simple," Thompson said. "Command needs planes. They will wonder why we stopped. They'll look for scapegoats. We have politicians asking for results." He steepled his fingers. "You can do this, Brackett, but be realistic." Brackett thought of the man in the ridge and of May's folded paper. Realism in his world was not an abstract idea. It was the recognition that a line of workers can choose to be faithful to a craft or to a timetable, but rarely both at once. He thought of what he had learned from metal. It will obey only those who take the time to listen. He left Thompson's office with no triumphant speech, but with a course set. He would not, could not, sign for machines he believed might fail. He spoke then to the shop stewards, men and women who moved between the union and the factory like tacit mediators. He explained the test, the bracket, the notation, and the way oil finds what is soft. There were faces that nodded, faces that hardened. Someone used the word safety, and someone else spat back patriotism, as if the two were opposing flags. "We can either keep making airplanes that fall apart," Ortiz said, "or we slow down and make them last. If command wants numbers, give them numbers of planes that returned, not funerals." The stewards took the matter to the night foreman. In a place where power often disguised itself in forms of bureaucracy, the foreman had a blunt way of speaking. "You want me to stop the line?" he asked. "If I stop, we'll all be in for a beating from production. The men'll be paid, but the plant might lose the contract. Who knows what that'll mean for us?" Brackett felt the room close on him like a vice. To insist risked the livelihoods of those who trusted the plant. To acquiesce risked pilots in the sky. He remembered the little ritual of his own learning, testing, failing, testing again until the machine obeyed. He thought of the quiet benedictions that rose after an enduring flight,
and of the different, sharper benediction that would rise in a pilot came home in a plane that had been made to endure. He stood up from the table as if from prayer.
"We do not send them up unless we are certain," he said. "If we are wrong, I will accept whatever comes. If we are right, then stopping will save lives. That is a decision I will stand by." The decision spread through the plant like a low current. Production slowed. Orders queued. In the union office, a list of men who could be let go temporarily was made. Faces turned to Brackett with the complicated gratitude that comes with hard choices. Some workers cursed the interruption. Others, whose families had already felt the absence of fathers or brothers, breathed as if a breath had been returned. Command's reaction was swift. Representatives arrived, not in dark suits this time, but in uniforms with pins that indexed their authority. They sent a telegram requiring the plant resume production within 48 hours or face the reallocation of contracts. They asked for reports and for assurances. Thompson argued on the plant's behalf, citing deliveries and the tightness of schedules. Brackett answered with tests, with the bracket's fracture, with the engineer's log where the A25 signature lay like a stain. They argued in terms of contingency and supply. Brackett argued in the language of metal, and the men who had hammered and filed and tried joined him with their evidence. May spoke quietly in one of the meetings, telling of Captain Green, of a man who had left a letter to his sister, of the small bright things pilots were permitted to think of as they climbed. "We make something to carry a life," she said. "If we break their carriers, then what's the point?" The room was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with authority. The inspectors promised a formal inquiry. While it was arranged, Brackett ordered the plant to replace the A25 brackets with a reworked specification, to tighten checks on lines and fittings, and to institute a new station for vibration testing. He knew these measures would slow production drastically. He also knew they would cost in terms that were immediate and visible. He had read that ledger long enough to know the shape of sacrifice. That night, as work resumed in the smaller, more exacting fashion he had demanded, Brackett walked the floor with Ortiz at his side. The lights seemed sharper under the new regimen. Every fitting was looked at twice, every torque checked and rechecked. Men who had once grumbled about delays now passed a hand over a casing as if blessing it. The plant took on the look of a place that had admitted uncertainty and was converting it into care. Outside, the city did its daily business of survival. Brackett thought of the public offices, the orders that moved like currents under a river of human need. He had no illusions about the scale of war. It made men into numbers, and numbers into narratives that could hide everything. Still, he believed, stubbornly, maybe foolishly, that a single small decision could tilt the balance between loss and return. The next morning, he found a new paper pinned to the board by Ma's bench. It was a note, this time longer. "For every hand that makes this aircraft," it read, "remember who will ride it." Brackett folded the paper into the pocket of his jacket like a prayer. The inquiry moved with the solemnity of the unavoidable. Men from command came and took testimony. They measured and asked for documentation. Their language was lit by the calculus of war.
But even their voices softened when they dealt with the human facts. Captain Green's report, the footage of the field, the metallurgical tests. It was in the metallurgy lab, under a microscope, that the truth made itself plain. The alloy from the southern mill had been grown out of desperation. The ore was leaner, the rolling process altered to save time, and the resulting grain in the metal held more stress than the original would have. Under steady vibration and the repeated change of pressure found at altitude, that bracket could split like an old bone. There was no villainy here, not in the sense of malice. There were causations, scarcity, the arithmetic of need, the human choice to alter a specification to keep an order moving. It was the old enemy of expedience, the great seducer, that had entered unnoticed into a factory where the day's work was already a small heroism. Command's officers took the report and read it with faces that made no claim to surprise. "We will correct the instructions," one said. "We will adjust the procurement chain." The words were the kind that make policy and soothe a moment, the machinery of bureaucracy aligning to do what it must. They also announced, in tones that softened when they referred to men, that production would be temporarily reduced at the plant while the rework took place. The reduction bit deep. Men were reassigned, overtime vanished, and a hush spread, as if winter had arrived early. The union called a meeting. There was anger there that was easy to name, pay cut, time lost, uncertainty. But there was also something less obvious, a thread that ran through many and could not be measured by payrolls. Men talked about the pilots. Women folded mending by the rows of benches and shared stories of letters from sons in camps. The small things came back into view. The face of a man who had laughed at a joke, the cadence of a voice on a telephone, the smell of a jacket left in the closet. Brackett found himself paying for groceries for Ma's family in a way he had not intended to announce. He helped Ortiz get a temporary seat, doing maintenance checks rather than being laid off. These were modest gestures, pale candles against the larger shadow. Yet in their quiet way they mattered. They were the small economies that kept a community able to continue. Outside the plant, newsreels showed footage of Mustangs in flight, their silhouettes cutting blue, and men applauded in crowded theaters where the war seemed, in those rooms, to be something heroic and remote.
Letters continued to come to the factory, some signed by names that meant little, others with photographs of pilots who had touched a heel to a plane and left their last smile. The board in the lunchroom filled with photographs like offerings, faces that expected return. And then came the day when a crate arrived at the plant. It was small, battered, and wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a flight jacket and a letter. The jacket bore the burn of wind, the shoulder worn where a pilot's strap had sat. The letter was short. "To the men and women who made the Mustang," it began. "I didn't get to fly the one you made for me. She held, though, for the 3 weeks I had her. She got my mate home once, and her lines held when his engine coughed. I don't know where the one that failed came from. Maybe you do. But know this. When a man straps into a plane and thinks of the girl who waits and the child who sleeps, he is trusting your hands. He calls for you without knowing it. Bring 'em home." J. Carter. Brackett read the letter twice. He had seen similar words before. They did not soften the edges of the choice he had made, but they gave it a steadier ground.
He ordered a small crucible of oil to warm with coffee and posted the letter above May's bench with a neat thumbtack. The jacket was placed on the hook that hung like a sentinel by the locker room. For all the abstract talk of policy and supply, the plant remained rooted in these acts: a letter pinned up, a jacket hung, a name remembered. However, decisions ripple outward. Command's reallocation threatened to move the plant's next contracts elsewhere. Thompson, who had spent his career mediating the seams between men and the ledger, took the matter to the regional office and returned with an ultimatum: perform an accelerated rate of output or have the plant's orders reassigned. They're not going to penalize the men, he said, but the way his voice cut made the sentence evaporate. Brackett found himself at a crossroad that was not entirely his to bear alone. Leaders in the Union spoke bluntly: "If command wants numbers, we'll give them, but not with our men and their lives on the line." Other voices in the plant said the same with different inflections. "We can get the work done. We can find ways." Brackett smelled danger in all of it. When people are pressed from two sides, the strain can produce either a finer edge or a fracture. Late one night, a group of men gathered in the dim light of the canteen. A radio quietly broadcast news in the far corner, the voice flat with distance. The talk circled the station like a tide: the plant's future, the pilots, the families. Brackett sat with his coffee cooling, two hands clasped around the tin mug. He listened more than he spoke. It was one of those gatherings where the small personal facts that tie strangers together become currency: a name, a child's age, a sister's address. "Suppose we don't make it," an older man said, "and Dayton gets the contract.
Where does that leave our kids? Where does that leave the rest of us? Suppose the men keep flying and engines are eaten by brackets that split," Ortiz answered, voice low. "And we keep making funerals. Who pays for that? Who carries that?" It was a question the room could not answer with reason alone. There were always consequences to weighing one harm against another. Brackett felt their weight like a physical pressure. He thought of Captain Green's parachute, Captain Carter's letter, May's folded note. He thought of the way a man in a jacket could carry back to the plant the knowledge that the line had been true or false. He rose then and spoke in the small way he had always done when a moment required a voice uncolored by rank. "We will make them safe," he said. "We will take the time to be sure." The room was quiet, as if waiting for the world to decide whether this pledge had the force of law. "And if command takes the contract?" the older man asked. Brackett looked at the faces and weighed the arithmetic of loss. "We will find a way to work after," he said. "If we cannot make metal sing true, then what good is speed? If the choice is hurry and death, or time and life, I choose life." The men around him hurled a portion of their anger at the notion as if it were a hot coal, and folded their ire into readiness. For all the risks, a moral clarity had been cast like a die. People take comfort in such things, even while resenting the price. Command did not like the plant's pause. There were threats and there were promises. There were men who argued that the time lost would cost more lives elsewhere by slowing the delivery of support.
and those who answered that a single crash took a life at a time that could not be recovered by fleets. In the end, the matter became a concession edged with compromise. The plant would rework the batches, but command would hold its order pending the demonstration of corrected parts. The plant would not lose the contract, for now, but the schedule would be revised. The men would work hard and under scrutiny. The new regimen was exacting. Machines were idled to make way for slower, more precise work. The vibration station hummed like a living thing. Brackett supervised with the intensity of a man who knew the cost of a slip. He rode the hours like a man in a boat through a channel plied with rocks. One mistake, and the hull could split. In the weeks that followed, the plant's pace altered its rhythm. Men who had once measured days by the click of hammers now measured them by a different metric. The curve of a stress graph, the time a feed line held under artificial vibration, the emotional contour of letters from pilots returned and pilots lost. There were small ceremonies, almost superstitions, that grew out of the practice. A hand across the machine before it was started, a moment of silence after a test that had run true.
People began to sign their names under the slogans with different intent, not an assertion of pride only, but of promise. Then, in late afternoon, as sunlight slanted low, the call came from the field. A Mustang had returned to its base after a long mission with only minor damage. The pilot's report said that the plane had held through a violent gust that had broken other aircraft. "Made it home," he wrote in one sentence. Somewhere in the plant, someone who had heard the news laughed and cried at once. A thank you note came later from the pilot to the plant. "You taught her to hold," it read. Brackett kept that note folded in his wallet like a talisman. Yet even as gratitude rippled, the world beyond the factory did not soften. The war demanded machines that could give service and in danger in equal measure. Brackett learned the landscape of moral attention was not a single ledger, but a shifting field where each new saving could be matched by another cost. Still, there were small victories that tasted of mercy, and those were enough to keep men coming in each morning. On a gray morning several weeks later, when the new bracket specification had been adopted and the vibration tests showed compliance, the inspectors from command returned. They watched, spoke in clipped sentences, and did not expect a miracle. Brackett led them to the line. He felt, unaccountably, as if he were a man about to read a verdict in a court of weather. The test flight was scheduled for the afternoon. At the edge of the field, standing in the pale wind, Brackett watched the Mustang ease into the sky, carrying weightier cargo than fuel and steel. A squadron flew in echelon, and the machines made patterns like a language. He thought of Captain Green's parachute folding against a ridge, and of Captain Carter's letter. He thought of the tools and the slow, exacting tenderness with which hands shaped the metal. When the plane came back, its engine purring like a pleased animal, instruments in the control tent read clean. The inspector who had once been so hard in his pronouncements stepped out, took off his cap, and walked to Brackett. "We see the change," he said. "Your tests were thorough. You did what needed to be done." Brackett met the man's eyes. He did not look for medals or praise. The inspector's words, measured and formal, were enough. "You have saved lives.
the man added, almost in a whisper. It was not an absolution, but it carried the weight of something close. Back in the plant, people gathered in small pockets and greeted each other with relief like a communal inhalation. They had been tested and found, for the hour at least, not wanting. May took down the folded paper from the board and wrote a new line beneath the old. Bring her home and keep her. She added a small drawing, a crude plane with a smiling face, and tacked it back as if to bless the work anew. But the war would not be paused for their relief.
Orders continued. The world beyond their plant turned on its axis of decisions made in rooms far from the shop floor. Brackett understood that their choice had altered only a narrow stream in a vast river. Still, for the men and women who worked their days in the bustle of machinery and the quiet of their own hearts, the choice had been necessary and true. There remained, always, the aftertaste of iron. To make such things was to hold the possibility of both deliverance and destruction. The moral attention the work required had not softened, it had become sharper. Brackett found himself thinking less of own accolades and more of the simple acts that comprised fidelity. The recheck of torque, the insistence on correct alloys, the care of a rivet whose head must be proud, but not proud enough to crack. One evening, as autumn edged the air with a chill, Brackett received a photograph pinned to the bulletin board. It showed a pilot with dirt on his cheek and a grin that had the carelessness of youth, standing beside his Mustang. Written on the back in an impatient hand, "Back again, thanks for the hands that kept her straight." Underneath, someone had scrawled a reply, "We keep them straight because someone will be waiting." Brackett folded the photograph and carried it with him that night, not to any altar, but to the sink where he washed the grease from his hands. He looked at his own reflection, tired but awake, and thought of the small decisions that accumulate into a life. The plant would go on. The war would go on. There would be further tests, more letters, tragedies that he could not prevent, and mercies he could not calculate. But in the ledger of days, there would be a column where choices were made to pause and to repair, and in that column, he had placed his hand. He stopped before leaving the shop floor, his palm against the cool skin of a newly finished fuselage. The metal met his skin with the faint warmth of a thing that had been shaped and cooled, taught and taught again. He murmured nothing aloud. The words in his heart were private and unlit. Behind him, May switched off the rivet lamp. Ortiz caught his eye and offered a small, nearly imperceptible nod. When Brackett stepped into the night, the air had changed, sharper, clean, with the promise of rain. A letter still hung on the board above May's bench. He could have taken it down, read it once more, and kept it as a talisman. Instead, he left it where it was, folded and faithful. He walked home with the sense of a day fulfilled, knowing that the plant's teaching of endurance, of attention, would be tested again. He had learned that making things that last required choices that might cost an hour, a wage, a place in a ledger. He had learned also that some costs, when paid now, kept open the possibility of other futures. In the weeks that followed, the production numbers inched back toward their proper shape. The plant's contracts remained intact. Men and women returned to their benches with the careful pace of people who had been reminded what their hands were for. Letters continued to arrive, sometimes with grief and sometimes with thanks. The world beyond the plant kept its own counsel, and Brackett learned to answer it in the only way he could, by insisting on measurements and by insisting on honor. There came, as always, a day when the sun dropped amber behind the rooftops and the factory shadow stretched long across the field. Brackett stood at the edge of the line as a Mustang took to the sky and carried another life into the distant blue. He felt the old ache, the knowledge that every success carried a shadow. But beneath it now lay another feeling, that when hands, minds, and conscience were aligned, even amidst the machinery of war, a small human mercy could be crafted. He turned away from the field and walked back into the plant where the light had been left on over May's bench. The note, "Bring her home and keep her," caught his eye. He smoothed it with a fingertip and, for perhaps the first time in many long months, allowed himself a cautious hope that the work would not merely teach metal endurance, but would teach people how to make better choices as well. He did not imagine the war ending on any single day. He only imagined, stubbornly, the next rivet struck with care. Outside the gates, the city thrummed with its own impossible life. Buses creaked, a dog barked in the distance, someone shouted a name. Brackett walked through it as through a town of small moral experiments. He had learned that the factory's obligation was not only to produce, but to remember. He carried that obligation like a private ledger, a tally kept by touch. And as night settled full, Brackett sat at his kitchen table and opened a letter he had kept from a pilot who had returned some weeks before. It was brief. "When I taxied off the field," the pilot had written, "I thought of the men I didn't know who had touched this plane with their hands. Thank you. It is heavy to carry such gratitude, but I carry it anyway." Brackett read the line twice, and then he rose and pinned the folded photograph and the pilot's note to the plant's board himself, right beside May's pen and paper airplane. His hand trembled, not from age, but from the strange gravity of small things set against immense need. Outside, the factory breathed on, a great and patient lung, teaching metal to endure and people to remember. Brackett turned out the lamp and walked home under a sky that looked indifferent and, if one were generous, watchful. He felt neither absolution nor condemnation. He felt a steady continuity, that each day offered the chance to do the work, to choose the small right thing, and to stand by it. In that steady way he would continue, as would the others, making what they could, and measuring, always, the cost.